Oh, Crockett again? Let me guess, another speech about justice? The defense lawyer didn't even look up as he said it, just a smirk, tossed into the air like a paper dart. The courtroom chuckled, not loudly, just enough to sting. But Jasmine didn't answer. She didn't even blink, because that day she hadn't come to speak. She came to listen, to the walls, to the weight of silence, to the breath between injustice and reckoning. She knew something they didn't. The justice doesn't always arrive with applause. Sometimes it walks in quiet, wrapped in memories, wearing heels that echo like footsteps from another lifetime. And so, as the morning sun carved narrow beams across the marble floor, Jasmine Crockett pushed open the courthouse doors. Not with anger, not with ceremony, but with the steady calm of someone who had finally come back to reclaim what had once been stolen in silence. The doors hadn't changed. Same scuffed brass handles, same cloudy glass, same heaviness that once made her hesitate before ever stepping through. Jasmine Crockett stood outside the courthouse she hadn't entered in nearly 2 decades. But the building didn't forget her, and she hadn't forgotten it. Her reflection stared back at her in the glass, calm, controlled, and far from the trembling teenager who had once stood here in a school uniform, biting her lip until it bled. Back then, no one had noticed her. Today, they wouldn't be able to ignore her. As she stepped forward, the door creaked, not loudly, but with a reluctance that felt strangely alive, like even the building was bracing for what was coming. The marble beneath her heels was colder than she remembered. Her steps were slow, intentional, each one echoing in the foyer with a tone that made the security guard glance up. He was young, no older than 30, probably new. He squinted at her, clipboard in hand. "Ma'am," he asked with polite doubt, "are you here for the defendant?" That word hovered like smoke. Defendant. Not federal counsel, not legal advisor. Just another black woman walking into a courthouse, and therefore, by unspoken presumption, on the wrong side of the law. Jasmine didn't flinch. She had heard this question in other forms her entire life. "Are you sure you're in the right place? Do you work here? Can I help you with something?" She reached into her coat pocket slowly, not rushed, not apologetic, and handed over her ID. Deputy Legal Advisor, Office of the Vice President, her name in bold, her photograph, the federal emblem glinting under the fluorescent lights. The guard blinked, not in fear, but in recalibration. That millisecond of mental math, the slow realization that this wasn't who he thought she was, or worse, that it was exactly who he feared she might be. He nodded, no apology, no welcome, just clearance. Jasmine didn't say a word. Her mother had always told her, "Don't waste breath asking for what's already yours." She walked past him and felt something shift, just barely. But it was there, the weight of memory pressing into her shoulders as she crossed the threshold into a building that had once eaten her whole. But this time, she wasn't here to be devoured. She was here to be remembered. And the walls were already listening. The hallway stretched ahead like a spine of quiet judgment, its fluorescent lights flickering just enough to remind her that some places refuse to age with dignity. Jasmine walked slowly, letting her fingers graze the edges of the wood-paneled walls, as if to feel what had been lost there. And there had been loss, so much of it. The first portrait stared down at her from its dusty frame. An old white man in robes, solemn, expressionless. Next to him, another, and another. A parade of judges, frozen in oil, etched into history not because they served justice, but because they held power long enough to be remembered. Not a single face looked like hers. Not one. Jasmine used to wonder, as a girl, if the walls could talk. Would they whisper stories of justice served, or secrets buried under silence? Now older and no longer naive, she knew the answer. These walls had memorized the sentences handed down to people who looked like her mother. People who were told their stories were inadmissible, their voices too emotional, their truth too inconvenient to fit the record. Her footsteps slowed as she passed a familiar bench, long, wooden, with iron legs that creaked if you shifted your weight too suddenly. She had cried on that bench, not loudly, just enough to fog her glasses and stain her collar. She remembered gripping the strap of her backpack so hard her knuckles turned white, trying to keep her body from trembling. Judge Miles had barely glanced at her mother that day. No hesitation, no mercy, just a flat, dismissive tone. Guilty as charged. The words were delivered like a coffee order. Jasmine had stared at the side of his face, trying to find something, anything, that made him human. But all she saw was policy in a robe. She paused now at that same bench, no longer a child. Her back was straight, her jaw locked. She didn't sit. She didn't need to. The girl who had once collapsed here had grown into the woman now walking these halls with a badge and a mission. And as she turned toward courtroom 3A, her mother's courtroom, the air shifted. Not around her, within her. Not fear, not sorrow. Readiness. She took her seat in the third row. Federal oversight seating, plain, unmarked, intentionally forgettable. Jasmine settled in without ceremony, her posture calm, her hands folded in her lap. She wasn't here to speak, not officially. Her badge gave her access, not voice. And in this courtroom, silence was more than decorum. It was a test. She knew how these rooms worked. She had studied them, sat through them, survived them. But this time, she wasn't watching as a student. She was watching as someone who had already seen this story play out too many times. The courtroom filled with murmurs and rustling papers. The gallery shifted. The clerk cleared his throat. And then, like a curtain rising on a play, rehearsed in shadows, the session began. At the center of it all sat Shonda Bell, a nurse, a veteran, a black woman, who now bore the title defendant. Jasmine watched her closely, saw how her shoulders didn't quite rest, how her hands fidgeted just beneath the table. The prosecutor looked tense, the defense smug. Judge Miles, perched above them, all like nothing had changed, flipped through a folder without meeting anyone's eyes. And then it started. The rhythm, motions, objections, overruled, sustained. Jasmine didn't need a transcript to know what was happening. The pattern was already unfolding, perfectly choreographed. Interrupt the witness, dismiss emotional testimony, overemphasize procedural gaps, plant doubt with sterile language. Every tactic was familiar, not because it was legal, but because it was practiced. The more they spoke, the more Jasmine recognized the cadence, the phrasing, the subtle weaponization of protocol. She leaned back slightly, eyes narrowing, not with shock, but with confirmation. This wasn't misjudgment. It wasn't unconscious bias. It wasn't even laziness. It was a design, a cold, calculated, repeated pattern dressed in the robes of law. And in that moment, Jasmine felt something settle inside her. Not rage, not yet, but a clarity sharp enough to cut through marble. This isn't broken, she thought. This is built. And if it was built, it could be mapped. And if it could be mapped, then it could be exposed. She sat still, didn't speak, didn't blink. Just wrote one sentence on her notepad with slow, deliberate strokes. This isn't a courtroom, it's a blueprint. The courtroom moved like a metronome. Jasmine's pen did too. Not out of habit, but with purpose. Tracking the words, the pauses, the rhythm. She wasn't writing a transcript. She was tracing a pattern. Subject appeared erratic. Use of moderate force deemed appropriate. Objection overruled. Strike from the record. They weren't just phrases. They were replicas. Legal echoes she'd heard before, buried in case files that most people never read past the summary. She flipped back a few pages in her notebook, where she'd scribbled notes from an old case in Baton Rouge. A young mechanic had been pulled over for a busted taillight, ended up hospitalized, and then convicted for resisting arrest. The judge's language, almost identical. Subject displayed elevated agitation. Testimony inconsistent with observed behavior. At the time, Jasmine thought it was coincidence, just the bland language of bureaucratic law. But now hearing it again word for word, it didn't feel generic. It felt intentional. Her memory sparked. Another case, an elementary school teacher in Monroe, fired and sentenced for tax misreporting. Same judge, same law firm, same phrasing. A third one, a night nurse convicted on a minor insurance fraud charge. Same structure, Same story. Slightly different faces, always the same ending. Jasmine's breath caught. She didn't move, just sat there frozen in the quiet horror of recognition. These weren't isolated judgments. They were reruns, rewritten names on the same script. It wasn't that the system was failing at random. It was executing a plan designed to be quiet, repeatable, invisible, and devastating. Her hand trembled slightly as she turned the page. She began writing again. Only this time, not just quotes or keywords. She listed case numbers, counties, judge names, legal firms, witnesses. She drew lines between them. Notes became diagrams. Diagrams became connections. And slowly, the outline of something far darker began to emerge. Not just misconduct, a mechanism, one built to fracture truth, sentence by sentence, and bury lives beneath the illusion of fairness. Jasmine's heartbeat slowed, not from calm, but from clarity. This wasn't accidental. It was a system, polished over years, perfected through indifference. And now, for the first time, it had left fingerprints. The memory didn't come gently. It surfaced like a ripple breaking still water, uninvited but undeniable. Jasmine saw it again, the plain manila envelope waiting on her desk 3 weeks ago, with no return address, no signature, only 4 words printed in block letters across the corner. For your mother's name. Not your mother, not Margaret Crockett, just her name. As if the truth didn't belong to the person, only to the history they'd tried to erase. She hadn't opened it right away. Part of her assumed it was a prank, or worse, a trap. But the handwriting was too careful. Not neat, careful. She waited 3 days before peeling the envelope open, breath shallow, hands steady. Inside, a worn court file, a yellowing intake report, and tucked between 2 pages, a clear plastic cassette. No label. Just a handwritten note folded around it. Not admitted. Now seated in her apartment, the city lights flickering through the blinds, Jasmine slid the tape into the old recorder she kept for archiving interviews. She pressed play, expecting static. Instead, her mother's voice filled the room. It wasn't loud. It wasn't angry. It was exhausted, even tone. Steady. I don't know if anyone will hear this. I don't think I care anymore. They didn't want the truth today, but I said it anyway. Maybe that's what justice is now. Just saying it, even when no one's listening. Jasmine froze. Her hand trembled over her mouth, her eyes stinging. It wasn't just what her mother said. It was how she said it. There was no pleading, no fury, only the kind of grace that comes when someone knows they've already been condemned and chooses to speak anyway. If someone finds this, tell Jasmine I didn't lose today. I just ran out of time. It shattered her, that one sentence. It reached across decades, pierced through layers of courtroom walls, of silence, of erasure, and wrapped itself around Jasmine's spine like armor. And then, softly came the last line. Don't burn for me. Bill Jasmine sat there for minutes after the tape clicked into silence. Not crying, not shaking, just breathing. Slow, deliberate, like someone who had just inherited more than grief. She didn't need vengeance. She didn't even need validation. She needed to finish what her mother never had the chance to begin. The city slept. Jasmine didn't. The hum of her desk lamp cast a pale halo over scattered folders, handwritten notes, and coffee rings that bled into the margins of printed case files. Her apartment was quiet, but her mind was a courtroom of its own, cross-examining every document, every ruling, every missing receipt and redacted line. By 2:14 a.m., she had identified 18 cases, 18 rulings issued under Judge Thomas Miles between 1998 and 2007, each bearing surgical inconsistencies. Not sloppy errors, engineered ones, minor charges elevated without merit, missing evidence never questioned, procedural objections overruled in patterns too consistent to be random. The victims were ordinary, nurses, teachers, veterans, maintenance workers. Mostly black, mostly poor, mostly alone. But now they were names on a list Jasmine couldn't unsee. She circled each one in red ink. Each circle felt like a pulse, a heartbeat from the past demanding to be counted. Her phone buzzed once, an encrypted message from an unknown number. At first, she dismissed it as spam. Then she read the text. I used to file his orders. I saw what he erased. You're doing what I used to dream of. Don't stop. Former clerk, 3A Division. She stared at the message for a long moment, then turned her phone face down. No need to reply. The acknowledgement was enough. She wasn't imagining it. She wasn't alone. By 3:30 a.m., her printer began to groan under the weight of truth. 127 pages. Legal transcripts, financial audits, phrase comparisons, and statistical anomalies cross-referenced against federal databases. She didn't bind them. She didn't staple. She let the pages breathe. Raw, loose, impossible to ignore. At 4:15, she pulled out her grandfather's fountain pen and began writing, by hand, a letter to the Department of Justice, not as a prosecutor, not as a politician, but as a witness. She wrote slowly, carefully, letting each word land like testimony. By dawn, her eyes burned, but her hands didn't shake. She ironed her jacket, slipped the folder into her bag, and stood at her window as the sky turned the color of resolve. She wasn't preparing a statement. She was preparing an interruption. And this time, the courtroom wouldn't see her coming. The room was mid-sentence when she rose. No signal, no warning. Just the quiet scrape of a chair and the shift of air as Jasmine Crockett stood up from the Federal Observer's seat, heels clicking softly on the polished floor. At first, no one reacted. The clerk kept reading. The defense attorney adjusted his tie. The prosecutor reached for another exhibit folder, and then slowly heads began to turn. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't ask permission. She walked. Every step was measured, steady, deliberate, cutting through the illusion of order like a scalpel through cloth. The wooden gate separating the gallery from the court floor stood before her, a symbolic divide between observers and participants, power and powerlessness. She didn't hesitate. She pushed it open with one hand, and it creaked louder than expected, as if the courtroom itself was startled. The judge looked up. Miss Crockett, he said, gavel raised midair. This is highly irregular. You are not authorized to approach the bench. But Jasmine didn't stop. She passed the witness stand, where voices had trembled, faltered, been silenced. She passed the prosecution table, where strategy had failed to interrupt injustice. She stopped 3 feet from the bench, facing the man who once sentenced her mother like he was ordering lunch. She set the folder down. Then quietly but clearly she said, "This is no longer a trial. This is an audit of justice." The words landed like a switchblade. The gavel didn't fall. Not yet. The judge's hand hovered, but his confidence cracked for just a second. Around the room, silence stretched. Tight, electric. The defense attorneys exchanged glances. A few jurors sat up straighter. Chandon Bell, still seated at the defendant's table, blinked like someone had just opened a window. Judge Miles cleared his throat, trying to recover. "You're out of order," he snapped. "No," Jasmine replied, her voice calm as steel. "I'm right on time." And just like that, the courtroom's choreography unraveled. For years, they had operated like a machine, well-oiled, predictable, quietly merciless. But now someone had stepped off script. Not in protest, not in panic, in precision. The air shifted, the story shifted, and for the first time, power didn't know what to do with its silence being interrupted. Jasmine didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The folder she placed on the rail was thick, worn, its edges soft from too many nights of being handled by hands that carried more weight than sleep. Red, not bright, but deep, like dried blood, or the velvet lining of something sacred. It didn't scream. It declared. With steady fingers, she opened it. The first document she laid down was a side-by-side comparison. 12 convictions, 12 different defendants, 12 nearly identical verdicts. Same phrasing, same timing, same judge. Every page bore official court stamps, dated, verified, certified. She placed them one by one, each sheet landing with the soft slap of truth hitting polished wood. Next came the correction logs, spreadsheets, financial ledgers, ledger amendments, cross-referenced entries that were never entered into evidence. One of them circled in red, case number 119-FK, Margaret Crockett. The deposit record missing from the courtroom, but confirmed at the bank. Jasmine paused only briefly as she placed it on the bench, her fingers lingering longer than necessary, not from hesitation, but reverence. Then without a word, she reached into the folder and produced the final item. The tape, a small, clear cassette in a transparent sleeve, its handwritten note still wrapped around it. Not admitted. She laid it gently at the top of the pile. It didn't shout, it whispered, but the room heard it anyway. Nobody moved. Judge Miles stared at the growing stack as if it were a live wire. And maybe it was, because everything they'd worked to bury was rising now, page by page. A soft gasp came from somewhere in the gallery. Then a voice, a reporter, too low to be official, but just loud enough to reach the row behind him. "She's not speaking truth," he whispered. "She is truth." Jasmine said nothing. She didn't need to monologue. The weight was already shifting. The evidence was doing what speeches never could, disrupting the silence with fact, dismantling the performance with time-stamped history. She looked at the jury, not with a plea, with a reminder. This isn't theory. This isn't emotion. This is what was left behind. And now it would no longer stay quiet. The courtroom didn't erupt. It exhaled. Two plainclothes agents from the Department of Justice stepped through the side door with the kind of calm that made people nervous. No words, no announcements, just quiet authority in motion. One held a sealed folder with the DOJ insignia. The other nodded once, to Jasmine, not to the judge. That was enough. Judge Miles stiffened. His gavel, still gripped tightly in his right hand, hovered above the bench like a weapon he no longer knew how to use. "This is improper," he barked, but the bite in his voice was gone, replaced by something thinner. "You have no jurisdiction here. This is my courtroom." The older agent stepped forward. He opened the folder and read from the document inside. "Federal arrest warrant, signed at 6:47 a.m. this morning. Charges include obstruction of justice, evidence tampering, and civil rights violations under color of law." The words struck like a bell that refused to stop ringing. Judge Miles opened his mouth again, but nothing coherent came out. He looked smaller somehow, less like the man who'd once sentenced Jasmine's mother with casual finality, more like someone caught rehearsing a lie for too long. "You don't know what this does," he muttered. "You're ending a career." "No, sir," the younger agent replied. "We're ending a pattern." A hush swept the courtroom, deeper than silence, almost holy. And then from the back row, a man rose to his feet. No outburst, no clapping, just a quiet stand. His face was older, worn. His eyes met Jasmine's with recognition. Then another stood, a woman this time, clutching a court-issued file to her chest. Then a third, a fourth. One by one they rose. 18 people scattered across the gallery like ordinary citizens, until they stood like monuments. These were the ones who had been sentenced in silence, buried in bureaucracy, erased by familiar phrases. Now they were standing, not for protest, for truth. Judge Miles was still seated, but the bench no longer belonged to him. The room had shifted, the scale had tilted, and Jasmine Crockett stood at the center, not shouting, not weeping, just present. Because justice hadn't arrived with thunder. It had entered on quiet feet, and now it stood tall. She didn't smile. She didn't cry. She simply stood still, 3 feet from where her world had once collapsed, and waited for the weight to settle. The courtroom was emptying now, slowly, reverently. No reporters swarmed. No microphones were shoved in her face. There were no flash bulbs, no celebratory claps on the back. Just the hush of footsteps retreating down long hallways. The closing of files, the soft click of the door behind the final juror. Even the air felt different, lighter, not because the battle was over, but because the silence no longer belonged to power. Jasmine turned back toward the gallery, her eyes landing on the wooden bench where, 23 years ago, she had once gripped the edge of her backpack and swallowed the kind of cry that leaves you aching for decades. That bench hadn't changed, still worn, still cracked along the underside. But the girl who once sat there was gone. In her place now stood a woman who had not only endured, but returned. She reached into the inside pocket of her blazer and pulled out a photograph. It was small, creased at the corners, faded slightly with time. Her mother, chin lifted, eyes fierce, one hand resting on Jasmine's shoulder, standing in front of this very courthouse long before it became a scar. Jasmine looked at the picture for a moment, her thumb brushing over the silver streak in her mother's hair that had come too early. Then she walked toward the judge's bench, not with defiance, not with victory, but with something softer, something earned. She laid the photograph gently on the center of the seat, not as a statement, not as a challenge, as memory. She looked at it once more, then stepped back. There was no applause. There didn't need to be, because what Jasmine Crockett had done wasn't built for noise. It wasn't designed for headlines or campaign slogans. It was personal, sacred, the kind of justice that returns not to be seen, but to see, to witness, to name, to finish the unfinished. And as she turned and walked out of the courtroom, heels silent against the marble floor, there was no need to look back. Some places, once reclaimed, don't require a second glance. The gates hadn't changed. Still tall, still heavy, still ornate enough to seem inviting, until you remembered how many it had kept out. Jasmine Crockett paused in front of them, the same law school that once politely discouraged her application now printing her name across the program as keynote speaker. Legacy Lecture Series. It sounded impressive, almost grand, but to her it was a quiet irony, because years ago they said she wasn't quite a fit, that her LSAT score lacked alignment with the institution's culture, that perhaps she'd find greater fulfillment in community-based legal programs. Now they wanted her back, not as a student, as a voice. She didn't bring a speech, no note cards, no headlines, just the same worn photograph of her mother, the one she'd placed on the judge's bench days earlier, and a mind full of moments that had never made it into law books. The auditorium was full, students, faculty, donors in their tailored suits lining the side aisles. The dean introduced her with a polished smile and a list of accomplishments. Congresswoman, civil rights advocate, former federal counsel. No mention of what it took to survive a courtroom designed to forget her. When Jasmine took the stage, she didn't stand behind the podium. She stood beside it. She held up the photo, not high like a banner, but close to her chest like a compass. My mother never studied law, she began, voice clear, eyes steady, but she knew what it meant to be ruled by it, to be erased by it. Silence held the room like breath. I wasn't born into this profession. I was dragged into it, watching a system that was supposed to protect us treat my mother like a case number instead of a person. She paused, not for drama, but for truth to land. Justice, she said slowly, is not a place you arrive at. It's something you build when no one's watching, and especially when they are. The room didn't applaud. Not yet. They listened. Jasmine looked at the faces staring back, some proud, some conflicted, some still unsure of what kind of lawyer they wanted to become. She didn't tell them to fight. She told them to remember, because some gates don't swing open. You have to make them. The hum of the overhead lights was the only sound in the room. No gavel, no voices, no footsteps. Just paper, stacked, creased, yellowed at the edges. Each file a name, each name a life. Jasmine Crockett stood in the middle of her office, surrounded by boxes taller than her shoulders. Some were marked with numbers, others had initials written in fading ink. They weren't just records. They were the buried architecture of a system that had once built walls from silence. She didn't touch them, not yet. She just stood still, letting the presence of them press against her, like echoes, like ghosts, like a promise she hadn't made, but now had no choice but to keep. On her desk sat one folder, thinner, older, soft at the corners, the same red file she'd carried into courtroom 3A. Inside, beneath the certified documents and audio transcriptions, was one final piece of paper, handwritten, folded into fourths, unlined. Her mother's handwriting curved across the page like a voice made visible. You do not walk alone anymore. She read it slowly, not for understanding. She knew what it meant, but for gravity, for weight, for the sound of it landing in her life. Jasmine didn't cry. The tears had been shed years ago in silence, on a courtroom bench that never remembered her name. This wasn't grief, it was continuity. She folded the letter carefully and slid it back into the file. Then she looked around the room. Hundreds of files, hundreds of injustices. Not symbols, not talking points. Just people who had waited too long for someone to notice that they had been buried under someone else's power. Jasmine walked toward the door. No press behind her, no podium waiting, no cameras, just the scent of old ink and the heaviness of responsibility. She didn't carry a badge or a campaign button, only the weight of what she now knew, and the choice to carry it forward. She paused once at the threshold, then stepped out, not as a politician, not as a hero, not even as the daughter of the accused, but as a witness. And for the first time in a very long time, the truth did not feel alone. Some stories don't end in verdicts. They end in footsteps, quiet, steady, and heading toward the kind of justice that doesn't ask permission. Jasmine Crockett never set out to become a symbol. She didn't fight to be seen. She fought because someone had once been unseen, unheard, and undone by a system that confused silence with peace. And in returning to the places that once erased her, she didn't come to confront power with rage. She came with proof, with memory, with lineage. And when the gavel finally cracked under the weight of truth, it wasn't her voice that echoed loudest. It was her mother's. What this story reminds us is simple, but hard. Justice isn't always loud. It doesn't always wear a robe or wait at the end of a trial. Sometimes it lives in the quiet conviction of someone who refuses to look away. Sometimes it is carried forward, not in headlines, but in the gentle unfolding of truth across time. And while the characters, settings, and moments here are stitched from fiction and fact alike, the emotions they reflect are very much real, because somewhere, right now, someone is sitting in a courtroom just like Jasmine once did, holding their breath, hoping someone will finally see them. Maybe that someone is you. So don't wait for justice to arrive on its own. Build it, brick by brick, story by story, voice by voice. Because the world doesn't need more silence. It needs people willing to break it, with courage, with evidence, and with love that remembers what the law forgot. Let this not be the end of a story. Let it be the beginning of yours. Thank you for staying with us through to this moment. It means more than you know. Every second you gave to this story is a reminder that justice begins with listening. If it moved you, let it live beyond this screen. Like the video, subscribe to join us for what's next, and turn on notifications so you never miss a voice that deserves to be heard. And please, we'd love to hear from you too. What part of this story stayed with you? What made you stop, feel, or reflect? Leave a comment below, because when we share what matters, our voices don't just speak. They connect, they make change.